Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about one of my favorite bands, Pink Floyd, and ranking their studio albums from worst to best. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists that we put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So like I said in the intro, I'm looking at just the 15 studio albums. A bunch of great stuff that Pink Floyd has released, from Piper of the Gates of Dawn back in 1967 all the way up to The Endless River in 2014. 15 studio albums, a bunch of great stuff. Some not so great stuff also, if I'm being completely honest, but they've been one of my favorite bands for a long, long time. I don't want this video to take too long, so I'm not going to delve too deep into these albums. So number 15 is the album that I've long considered their worst album, the worst thing that they ever put out. Even though there is some redeeming stuff on here, there's also some really bad stuff. It's an album that I can really do without when it comes to their catalog. But this was released back in November of 1969. It's an interesting album, but it's Amagama. This is a kind of a split, kind of a hybrid album. There's some live stuff on here, which the live stuff is actually really good. But then the 4 studio tracks on here, in my opinion, is hands down the worst that Pink Floyd ever did. I don't really know what they were trying to do with it. I know each member of the band did their own solo song, and it just didn't work. But a few months before Amagama was released, in June of 1969, they released the album that I've got at number 14. It is the soundtrack for the movie More, and there's a couple of good tracks on here. You know, I don't want people to think I'm completely crapping on this album. There is a couple of really good tracks, but really, there's really, I'd say, two tracks that I kind of go back to and listen to. The rest of the album is kind of forgettable, I think, but I think this is their first album without Syd Barrett as a member of the band, and I think the band was trying to find themselves musically, and they just really hadn't gotten there yet. At number 13 is probably where I start. I'll start getting some hate in the comments here, because I know a lot of people love this album, but I've just never really been able to get behind it, even though I understand that it was a really kind of pivotal album when it was released. Influenced a lot of other bands in the late 60s, early 70s. This was released in August 1967. It is their debut album, The Piper of the Gates of Dawn. I think it's got the best title of a Pink Floyd album. I love the title of it. The artwork's really cool. I'm just not big into the whole psychedelic thing, and it just there's a lot of that on here, and I understand it's kind of held up as one of those great psychedelic albums of the late 60s, and I get all that. It just, musically for me, I think their best work was obviously yet to come. At 12 is an album that I've really tried to love, and I get what they were trying to do with it. It's just not that great, at least in my opinion. This was released in November of 2014. It is the last album from Pink Floyd. This is The Endless River. I get it. This is all a tribute to Richard Wright, who died back in 2008. And these are all taken from tracks that he had done in the Division Bell sessions. I think what hurts this album is the last track. There's only one track on here that I think More Than Words, I think, is the name of it. Louder Than Words is the name of the track. I think it is hands down the worst way to end the long storied career of Pink Floyd. That one track is just a horrible track in my opinion. I like the rest of the stuff that's on here. Just that one track just really, I think, really kind of knocks it down for me. I'm sure I'll get some heat about the album I got at number 11 also, because I know a bunch of people love this album. I've got a couple of friends that this is probably one of their favorite Pink Floyd albums, but I have some big issues with it, even though there are some really good tracks on here. This one was released in September of 87. That is A Momentary Lapse of Reason. So this is the first album without Roger Waters as part of the band. And to be completely honest, like I said, there's some really good tracks on here, but this really should have been a David Gilmour solo album. Some of the tracks on here were intended for his solo album, but and they kind of should have. I think they should have done it that way. He had a bunch of session writers in there. Nick Mason was really only played drums very little on this album. Richard Wright wasn't involved a whole lot with the album. It was basically David Gilmour and a bunch of studio musicians and guest writers. So the album that I got at number 10, I think, is one of the more underrated albums as far as the Pink Floyd discography goes. And to be honest, it was an album that it took me a really long time to really get into. This one was released in March of '83. It is the final cut. This is the album that this was the last album that Roger Waters was a part of. I guess you can kind of call this the last like real Pink Floyd album, at least for a period of time. And at least I guess the Division Bell was where the band really kind of got back together and really kind of refocused itself. But like I said, this is an album that it took me a really long time. I grew up loving The Wall. The Wall was probably my favorite Pink Floyd album for a really long time. And because of all the inner turmoil in the band, I didn't really, I don't know, I just never really got into this album. And I didn't think it was all that great. It was probably within the last, really 5 or 6 years before I really dug into this album and really kind of fell in love with some of the stuff on here. And number 9 is Numb. It's really interesting. There's some really great stuff on here. I think the opening 3 tracks are absolutely fantastic. And then there's also some very highly questionable stuff on here. It's all very psychedelic, which, like I said before, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the psychedelic stuff. But like I said, it's an interesting album to kind of go back and dig into. It's the last album with Syd Barrett. It's the first album with David Gilmour, released in June of 1968. It's their second album, A Saucer Full of Secrets. Let There Be More Light has been one of my favorite tracks for a long, long, long time. But like I said, the opening tracks are really great. And then you got a song like, A Saucer Full of Secrets, the title track. It's long and it's interesting. And it's very heavily psychedelic. And like I said before, it's just not really kind of my style of music. But I get why people do love this album. And number 8 is an album that kind of like the Final Cut. It took me a long time to really get into this album. But there's some really kind of redeeming stuff on here. Same thing with a lot of the albums I've talked about so far. Also some very questionable stuff. And it's an album that David Gilmour and Roger Waters both absolutely hate. I think Roger Waters actually called it embarrassingly awful, I think is what he said. But this was released in October 1970. That's Adam Hart Mother. And this is like their last, I think, truly experimental album. This was an album that, after this album came out, is when I think they really kind of found their style and where they wanted to go musically. And where it worked on some other later albums, it didn't quite work on here, but listening to this album, listening to the next couple of albums, you could hear where they were building to what they would do on albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, albums like that later on down the line. But I think this Adam Hart Mother is where you really found, where you could hear the band discovering itself. And number 7 is another one of those albums that I think is really kind of underrated as far as Pink Floyd albums go. A lot of people talk about all the other great albums the band did throughout their career, and they did. They definitely did better albums. Like I said, this is number 7 for me. But there are some really great songs on here also. It's a very short album. It's very kind of, it's more acoustic than a lot of the other Pink Floyd stuff did that they did over the years. It was released in June of 1972, and that is obscured by clouds. So this is a soundtrack album. This was supposed to be for a French film, La Vallée, I think is how you pronounce the name of the movie. I've never seen the movie, but the songs on here are really good. And you got a song like What's the Deal, which is probably my favorite song of this album. Kind of a quirky, kind of a dumb name, but it's a great song. It's definitely one worth checking out if you're unfamiliar with this album. So the last 6 albums I got are all just absolutely incredible albums. The one I got at number 6 is an album that I really consider the return of Pink Floyd. They finally put it all back together and created an incredible album. This was released in March of 1994. That is the Division Bell. And like I said, when I talked about Momentary Lapse, the reason it was very kind of disjointed. It was very much a David Gilmour solo album. This is where the band put it all back together. Richard Wright was finally a full member of the band. Nick Mason did a great job on this album. David Gilmour, I think some of his best guitar work is on this album. Where I kind of knock this album a little bit is I'm not a huge fan of. So Polly Sampson at that time she was David Gilmour's girlfriend. I think she did all the lyrics on this album. Some of the lyrics I don't really think fit musically, but I get where they were going with this album. And it's an album I've loved since I first listened to it. So we're finally down to the top 5, and I will say that my number 1 album has always been my number 1 album, but 2 through 5 I think are pretty interchangeable. If I were to make this list next week, it probably could have been very different, but at least for the album I've got at number 5 right now, I think is their most underrated album. It's an album that I think gets overlooked way too much, even though it does have a couple of really classic Pink Floyd tracks on there. But this one was released in November 1971, and that album is Metal. And, this album is known for echoes, but there's so many other great tracks on here. I know some people hate the song Seamus, and there's some other interesting stuff on here, but I think the collection of this album is that kind of driving force where you can hear a band really becoming what they would be. I know they did Obscured by Clouds before Dark Side of the Moon was released, but it was really on this album, and it really Adam Hart Mother that came out before it, where you heard Pink Floyd becoming Pink Floyd. And that's where you hear, there is some more, a little bit of psychedelic stuff on here, but they're definitely breaking away from that, adding a lot more progressive rock stuff into their albums, into their music, and really kind of building up to what they would do. The album that I've got at number 4, like I said before, it was for a long time. It was my favorite Pink Floyd album, but over the years, it's dropped down a little bit once I kind of fell in love with some other stuff from the band. But I've long considered this the greatest double album ever recorded. It was released in November 1979. Of course, that is The Wall. A bunch of great stuff on here, but this is also the album that I think really kind of broke the band. It was, I think it was during the tour for this album is when Richard Wright was fired from the band. He was really only kind of used as a session musician during the recording process. It was definitely a tough period for the band musically, and they did some great stuff on this album. And I know people look at or listen to The Wall and think there's a lot of stuff they can kind of throw off this album and make it a stronger album. But with some of those kind of quirky, interesting songs, I think really kind of what puts the whole story together and makes this album as great as it is. The album that I've got at number 3, really, I guess, is at number 3. I think I've got 2 tied at number 2. So I got 2A and 2B. So I guess this is kind of like the 2B album. Released in September of 1975. That album is Wish You Were Here. For the longest time, I guess Wish You Were Here was the only track I really listened to off of this one. And I think it was like so overplayed on the radio. Is why for a long time I didn't really listen to this album. And then once I started digging into it, of course, Shine On You Crazy Diamond is an incredible track. Both the first half of it and the second half of it. I love both of them. But I think my favorite track on this album is an interesting track because it's the only track from Pink Floyd that wasn't sung by a member of the band. And that is Have a Cigar. It's sung by Roy Harper. And, Roy, of course, had a long and distinguished career on his own, but what he did on that one track was fantastic. I know there are some outtake tracks where David Gilmour and Roger Waters are both trying to sing the one track, and they really couldn't kind of get it down. Roy Harper was recording in the studio next door to them, was hanging out, laid down the vocals, and it was that was the history for that track. It's a great track, really underrated track, and one that like I said before, it's my favorite one on this album. The album that I've got at number 2 is hands down one of my favorite albums of all time. I definitely put this one up in the top 10, top 15 albums. One that it's dark, it's social, it's political, it's everything you would think Roger Waters could write and would write. I think it's as far as his writing career goes, I think it's definitely the pinnacle of his work. And that was released in January of 77. Of course, that album is Animals. It's an interesting album. Like I said, it's very dark. It's heavier than I think a lot of the other stuff that Pink Floyd did, especially in the 70s. But you get a song like Dogs, which is long and it's progressive and it's really kind of over the top at some points. But it just the guitar work on that song is just absolutely beautiful. And it's I think David Gilmour, the work he did on this album is really kind of what made this album as great as it is. And then, of course, by no surprise, the album that I've got at number 1, it's my favorite album of all time. I talk about it all the time. It was released in March 1973. Of course, that is The Dark Side of the Moon. It's the favorite. I think it's, in my opinion, the greatest album ever recorded. It's an absolute masterpiece, man. It's innovative. There's so many different things on here. You got there's jazz influence on here. There's blues influence on here. Of course, it's a great rock album. So many different things. It all kind of flows together, makes this great one big masterpiece. It is the greatest of all time. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what your favorite Pink Floyd albums are. You don't have to do all 15 of them, but throw out some what you think are great. Throw out some that you think aren't so great. Love to know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.